Hi, and welcome to this tutorial on how to organize your RMD Markdown file. This tutorial will explain some of the various codes and labels that are available to help you organize your Markdown file and the associated knitted output. I'll start with a strong persuasive argument for why it's helpful to use labels and other systems for organizing your file as you go. Then for each element, I'll show you the code and the associated knitted output so that you can see what this will really look like in your final work. So let's get started. Here's the file that we'll be using to practice the techniques that I'll be discussing today. You can see we've got our title, author, the date, and some setup code here, and a whole bunch of text and code if we scroll down. So, as promised, I'll start by sharing why it might be so important to use these organization tools when you're working in RStudio. Organized and labeled code and sections are easier to navigate, especially in long multi-part projects. And you know, our projects can get pretty long and complex. Plus, using these strategies creates opportunities for you to show your work, keep notes on your process, and record your purpose for each step in your project for later use. This is helpful if you're working on a team with collaborators and want to communicate with them about your steps, or if you think you might want to use this code again for another project in the future. Okay, let's get oriented. So, as you know, you've got your white space and your code chunks. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the different things you can do in each of these types of sections and the different systems you can use in each. So we'll start by talking about the white space. Anything written in your white space won't be analyzed when you finally run your code in the code chunks. And so this is a good place to put interpretation of what happens in these analyses, and also to set up what you want your final product to look like once you knit your document either to Word or HTML. So here you can start to see that we're using some title headings using these hashtags. So you can see our top level heading and then a subheading and then a subheading below that using these hashtags, 1 hashtag, 2, 3, and so on. So one thing I'll mention is don't forget to leave a space in between the hashtag and your text, otherwise it will not apply the heading format. So we can go and check out what this is going to look like in this preview pane here. If we navigate up to the top and click that, and it will show us a preview of our HTML. And here you can see where we included our different headings and also that spot where we did not include the space and the different subheadings. Okay, let's get out of this preview mode so we can look at just a couple more tips for formatting in the white space before we move on to code chunks. So here you can see that we can create a bulleted list using dashes in front of our text. You can nest your bullets, so making an outline form just by bumping in using spaces to create an outline format. And you can also format your text itself with some functions here. So right here you can see that we can create italics with single asterisks surrounding our text, or we can make something bold with double asterisks. And we also have these other examples of code that we can use for subscripts, but we won't get into that too much today. And let's go ahead and take a look at the preview pane so we can see what that will look like in our knitted output. So here we've got our italics, our bold, those other subscripts, and you can really get a sense for how this starts to become a really nice final product. Okay, let's head back to our source editor so that we can start talking about code chunks. And so you can see that I've got a couple of code chunks in here, and they all have code chunk names. So all code chunks, when you first input an empty code chunk, have these little hash marks and then an R and a blank line where you have the opportunity to name your code chunk. And these code chunk names are really handy, and actually this is a good segue to tie in what we were talking about earlier with our headings and so on, because when you go down to your table of contents, you can see all of your heading names and your subheadings, and then also the names of your code chunks. So this is really helpful when you're navigating through your RMD to find work that you've done. So you can see here that code chunk that I added and I didn't name, it doesn't have any title. So if I had a whole big long list of those, it would be hard to take advantage of this table of contents to find your way to what you're looking for in your RMD. So that's my first plug for naming your code chunks. Now there's some details in how you name your code chunks that are important that we'll get into now. So here you can see these two code chunks have the same name. If we scroll down to see what's going on there, there are two different plots that are looking at different variables. This one is looking at birth weight by mom's race, and this one's looking at birth weight by mom's smoking status. So they're similar, they're both looking at birth weight, but different variables. So if you tried to knit this document this way, it would not allow you to. So we need to go in here and give the code chunks unique names. It can be 1 and 2, it could be the variables that you used, it could be which research question you're working on for this particular code chunk, but somehow giving them unique names so that you can knit your document eventually when you're complete. There are also certain characters that won't allow your document to knit if they're in your code chunk name. So if you get an error message like that, just check and see if you have any funky characters there, and you can just use spaces or underscores are always a safe bet when you're naming code chunks. All right, next let's talk about collapsing our code and output in the RMD. So here you can see there's this code to generate the summary of the data set and also to run descriptive statistics. And this is something we might need to do in order to get values to use for another analysis. So when we click this button, we get this output that has multiple frames, takes up quite a bit of space in our workspace, and then we can also see the code here. So in this case, and in other cases, you might not really need to see this very much after you run the code that first time. So it can be useful to kind of hide it away. So you can use this button here to collapse the code so you can still see the code chunk name, and it still shows up in your table of contents here, but it's sort of out of the way, so you don't have to be scrolling past it every time you're navigating through the RMD. Next, we're going to talk about some different commands that we can use in our code chunk names to customize our output into our knitted document. So let's come on down here and talk about customizing code chunk output. And so there's quite a few different commands we can use. We'll go through a few common ones. And one thing to know is that the default for all of these commands is always true. And I'll explain what that means as we go through each one. So we'll just start with this simple regression analysis here so that we can have an example of code to work with. And I'm going to go ahead and run this, and you can see that I don't have any extra customizing commands in this code chunk, so it will default to true for all of the rest of the code, the commands that we're going to be talking about here. So let's scroll down. The first one we're going to talk about is echo. You can use this echo command to tell Knitter whether or not you want to have your code show up in your knitted document or not. So remember, if you leave nothing there, then it defaults to true and your code will appear in your knitted document. If you include false, then the code will run and you will get this output in your knitted document, but the code will not show up. Next, we'll look at this evaluate command. So if you include eval or evaluate false, then the code in this code chunk will not be run and will not be included in your final document. So we'll go ahead and run this code chunk, and remember that This one is evaluate false. So we'll get to see what that looks like when we knit our final document in just a little bit. Next, we're going to talk about this include command. So let's scroll on down, and include is a command that when you enter false here in the code chunk line, it will prevent both the code and the results from appearing in the finished file, but other code chunks in the file can still use the output from that code chunk. So here's an example. If we were calculating the multivariate outliers here with this code, and we run this code, you can see that even though we called for the table, nothing is output, and the same thing will happen in the knitted RMD. But if we go ahead and just simply call that table now, ta-da, there it is, even though it didn't get produced by this last code chunk. And lastly, we'll talk about this warning false command to put in our code chunk. So if you put false here and you get some sort of warning, that warning message won't get printed out in your knitted RMD. So let's try that here. We get a couple of fun warning messages with this ANOVA, and we'll be able to see once we run this knitted document that those don't appear in our final product. So that's it for commands, but before we move on from code chunks, I just want to point out that we have these notes embedded within our code chunks here. So hashtags act differently in the code chunk versus in the white space. When you put some text with a hashtag in the beginning of it in the code chunk, it gets commented out of your analysis. So this is a great place to put notes to remind yourself what you are doing with each step of your code, especially if you're working on an analysis or a problem that has many different steps and you want to include them all in one code chunk. Now we're ready to knit our final product, our final document. So we're going to go up here and choose knit, and this time I'm going to go ahead and knit to HTML because I think that some of the formatting that we did comes out looking a little bit nicer in the HTML format, but you can also knit to Word. And we'll go ahead and run this knitter and see that that our is chugging away and successfully producing our file because we were really careful about naming our code chunks and keeping everything nice and happy throughout. And now down here we can open up this HTML in our web browser and take a look at what we got. So you remember way back in the beginning of this tutorial, we got our headings, we have our bulleted list, we have our formatting, and to our code chunk commands, we can see that gets going right here. So here we see that our first code chunk where we didn't use any commands looks like that. And then the second code chunk was where we said false to echo, and so we don't see the code chunk there at all, we just see the output. And then next we have this eval false code, and this one didn't run at all. And then next we had our include false, and so you can see there's nothing there at all with that ANOVA or with that multivariate outliers code, but when we ran the table, here it is, the table that we were able to produce from the output from that previous false include code. And lastly, there's this warning false code. So we've got our ANOVA and no warning messages are messying up our output. And that is our full knitted document. Just one more thing I wanted to show you that's been helpful for me in navigating my RMD files. So let's go back to our Markdown. So heading back to our Markdown, we're just going to close that up and get back into this file. So one thing that's been helpful for me is using file find. So very simply, if there's something in the RMD that you're looking for that you need to go and correct, you can use your Command F function and open up this find box up here. So for example, if some reason we wanted to change the name of the variable that we used for one of these variables, and we wanted to make sure we caught every single time it happened in the RMD, we might put in moms here and go ahead and say we're going to change this every single time. Maybe we want to change it to mothers or something like that, and go ahead and click through all of the examples of where moms shows up in this whole file so that we can address all of those. And that is it for our tutorial today on organizing your RMD. I hope that you found some gems in here today that will help you to navigate through your files more successfully and solve all of your statistical problems. Thanks!